Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Greg Barnes, Senior Counsel and Advisor to the Julian Assange legal team. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Now, what I wanted to start with here is, given the extradition treaty that exists between Australia and the US, if Julian Assange was able to get back to Australian soil, would he or could he be protected from extradition, or does the treaty that exists make it automatic that he would have to be sent to the US?
Oh, it's a very good question, Natalie, and the answer to your question is there is a risk that he would be extradited to the United States. It's a different treaty to the treaty which exists with the UK. To be fair, the federal court in Australia, I think a number of the judges in the federal court would recoil at the prospect of an extradition in this case, but you cannot rule out the possibility that that could happen if he came back to Australia.
And has there been any conversation that if he was able to make it back to Australia, that Australia would try and protect him, or that hasn't even been a part of the conversation?
Well, I think if he were going to return to Australia, it would have to be on the basis that the Australian government would not entertain an extradition request from the United States. Because, of course, just because a country wants to extradite you doesn't mean that the Australian judicial system and legal system will entertain that request. It has to be sanctioned by the Commonwealth. And so there'd have to be that understanding and that agreement. Otherwise, why would he come back? I think, though, that to just come back to a point I made in the first part, that the problem with the United States is, and you asked me about other jurisdictions outside of Eastern Virginia, and you can't get a fair trial in the United States. And the reason you can't get a fair trial in the United States, and this, of course, would be a relevant factor in any Australian extradition request, is because of if he's not allowed to have the First Amendment protection, and secondly, because of the atmosphere in the US, which you would know better than me, makes it very, very difficult to get a fair trial in these types of cases. And so that would be a relevant factor that Australia would have to look at if it was going to entertain a request.
So the UK magistrate that denied the Americans' right to deport Julian Assange, what are you expecting from his legal team as a counter strategy?
Well, it's really up to the lawyers for the United States government now, who, as I understand, are appealing. The view that I have read from colleagues in the UK is that they're unlikely to be successful. In other words, that they're unlikely to win the appeal, because what the judge did was to essentially agree with the United States government's arguments, but indicated that because of the grave risk to Julian's health, she would not extradite, would not order extradition. And that's because the United States said that it would hold him in solitary confinement for years on end. And it was because of the psychiatric evidence that said he was a high suicide risk. Now, in those circumstances, you've got a judge who's assessed the witnesses, who's heard the evidence. It'd be unlikely, you would think, that an appeal court would overturn that decision, but you never know in this case. But certainly I have read some comments from colleagues who know what they're talking about in this particular area of law in the UK, who think that the United States is unlikely to be successful in an appeal.
So when the appeal is launched, what will his team, Assange's team strategy be in fighting that? Will they just keep going back to what the magistrate's decision was or what the ruling was, or is there something else that would come into it?
Well, normally with an appeal, what you're doing is you're not re-agitating the case. You're just saying, was there an error of law made by the judge or magistrate who originally heard the case? And if there's no error of law, then there's no win in the appeal. With an appeal, it's really up to the US to convince a court. They're the ones who've got to get the decision overturned. I mean, I'll say this, though, that the more broadly, I think the issue is whether or not the Biden administration will continue with this attempt to prosecute. There were some comments made by a Department of Justice employee recently who'd been on the case, who thought, in his view, that the Biden administration may not continue with this particular case. That would be the best result, because it would mean there'd be no further extradition requests. but also would mean that it puts to bed this ongoing saga forever and a day.
And what was the motivating factor behind the Ecuadorian government's decision to kick Julian Assange out of the embassy?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. I think that the president who gave Julian asylum retired, I think, after 2 terms and didn't stand again. His deputy was initially sympathetic, but then essentially got bought out by the Americans. He got loans that were sought loans from the United States on the basis of turning on Assange. And it was, the conduct of Ecuador was extraordinary because once you grant asylum to a person, it's very, very unusual to then say, we're now going to withdraw that asylum. And as a matter of international law, it's appalling conduct. But that's what happened. The Americans have had their fingers all over this from day one, have been tenacious in the way in which they've gone about trying to get Assange before the courts, and that was part of it.
So what charges is Julian Assange being held for in the UK?
So the charges that we discussed earlier are essentially under the espionage legislation, conspiracy to obtain, and putting this in layperson's terms, but conspiracy to obtain materials that are classified secret, encouraging hacking. They're the types of offences. Originally, the Obama administration was not keen on those Espionage Act charges because it was of the view that Assange might be able to avail himself of the First Amendment defence. But it was the Trump administration which declared more war on the media in so many ways, which decided to ramp up the charges against Assange. And so that's why I think it will be interesting to see if the Biden administration reverts back to what Obama did or whether it continues with the Trump administration's set of charges.
Is there any chance of Julian Assange living as a free man in the UK?
Well, certainly. I mean, if the extradition is over, if the charges are withdrawn, or if he's pardoned by President Trump before President Trump leaves office, which of course is very, very imminent. Of course, he can live as a free man. The question where Julian goes is a matter for himself and his family, but he, of course, has no other charges pending in any other jurisdiction, and he walks out the door.
So when the appeal happens, and if the Assange's legal team win that appeal by the US government, at that point, can he be freed from prison, or does he remain in Belmore until the Americans give up?
Well, again, that's a question of whether or not he would get bail. He applied for bail and was unsuccessful, so had to stay there until the appeal. I would have thought that if the United States was unsuccessful in its appeal, it might think very seriously about whether or not it was going to continue in the case, because normally there's a bit of a sign there. If you've lost initially and then you've lost again on appeal, it doesn't augur well for a further appeal. But unfortunately, he was not granted bail despite the conditions he's in Belmarsh. And if the United States lost the appeal and then said, well, now we're going to take it a step higher, the question would be whether or not Assange would be given bail.
When do they have to file the appeal by?
Well, I think they had 14 days from the date of the decision. And the appeal will be heard, no doubt, sometime in the next 2 or 3 months, I think. And it'll be heard by a single judge. And then from there, depending on the result, it then goes to 3 judges in what's called the Court of Appeal. And then it would go to the UK Supreme Court, which is like the US Supreme Court or the Australian High Court.
So there's still a little way to go before there is an end to this, if that's the way that the US government decides to proceed.
Correct. So unless there's a pardon, or unless the Biden administration drops the charges, or Australia is able to negotiate something on Assange's behalf, this matter will proceed into next year, because whichever side loses will appeal to the next court.
This seems like the story that will never end, but hopefully there'll be a final result at some point soon. Greg Barnes, thank you so much for speaking with us. We appreciate it, and we look forward to speaking to you again with an update.
Thank you, Natalie.